Good morning and welcome to Utah Matters. I'm Dean Painter. Last week on this program, we began a discussion about the use of lethal force by police and why there seems to be an increase of that in our state. We got in the middle of that discussion and decided that we weren't going to get through it in a half hour. And so we decided to keep the tape rolling and bring the second half of that to you now. Before we get there, we want to show you, to set the table, some of the highlights and some of the key points, elements that were argued and discussed last week.
We essentially began to protest what we saw was unjust shootings of both a unarmed black African-American person in Missouri, as well as an unarmed person at 7-Eleven, hanging out with his brother and his cousin.
The Supreme Court talks that they recognize police officers operate in a chaotic, fluid environment with ever-changing circumstances, and that we can't use 20/20 vision to go back and analyze split second by split second what the police officer should have done or could have done, but what that police officer knew at the time and were his or her actions reasonable.
The other thing that I think is controversial is whether or not a shooting is legally justified. I think that an important question is whether or not it's necessary.
I want to go through a checklist of different things that people think about when they see something like this and they go, why didn't you do this? And I want your response to this because they're common. One of my favorite one is from a television program called Person of Interest. And James Caviezel shoots the bad guys in the knees to disarm them. That's what he does. He doesn't immediately go for deadly force, but he shoots them in the knees. Why shoot a person in a place that can kill them?
Shooting somebody in the knees is deadly force, and people can die from shooting in the leg. There's a variety of reasons.
But police are not trained to shoot in the knees.
Right. The question I always ask back to somebody who asks, why don't you just shoot them in the legs? Find me one professional handgun defense trainer in this nation that will teach to shoot for the legs, and we'll have that discussion. Right. There isn't anybody, and the reason is, over hundreds of years of firearms training, we've discovered that in these types of fast encounters, number one, there is no place on the human body you can shoot at that won't possibly kill that person. Number two, in an actual armed encounter, everything's happening so fast and handguns aren't accurate enough to simply pick a spot and say, I'm going to shoot this person in the kidney, I'm going to shoot this person in the knee, I'm going to shoot that person in the shoulder. That's not how these kind of encounters go down. And third, officers are trained that if you're in a lethal encounter, to save your own life or to save the life of those around you, your job is to stop that threat.
Why not tasers?
Both prongs have to make contact, have to pierce the skin, and it has to be over a fairly wide range of the human body in order to be effective. In my own experience, tasers are maybe effective, maybe 50% of the time. And most officers know this. They can be defeated by distance, clothing, movement. Somebody can be too far or too close. Somebody can be wearing a baggy jacket, and all these things are going to defeat a taser. So if you believe that your life is in danger, if in this moment your training and experience has kicked in and you said, oh, I'm about to be killed, are you going to risk using a tool that's 50% effective? Are you going to go to the tool in a lethal encounter as you've been trained? The tool that will save your life in this particular encounter is your handgun. Now, what doesn't get covered in the news are the literally thousands of other cases in this state where officers did use a taser to save their life, where it did make sense, but it doesn't get any news coverage. What's the coverage going to be? Officer doesn't shoot? I mean, we don't seem as a society to be interested in the important work that officers do to de-escalate very violent situations where people are literally trying to kill them. What we see are the 9 or 10 or 14 last year incidents where, for whatever reason, a confluence of events, the suspect posed an immediate lethal threat to the officer, and the officer took the action he believed he needed to save his own life.
Very quickly, Steve, did you have a comment?
Well, I mean, I don't want to push the issue of body cameras too much, but I think that that's one of the great things about body cameras is we can go and learn from prior situations.
Absolutely.
Like Ian said, I mean, we can't judge every specific situation and how somebody should act in this situation or that situation. But as we review these things as they happen, then we're able to train officers better and say, this would have been a better option, or this use of force was unnecessary or excessive. Only when we're able to look back at what we've done wrong are we able to correct what we can do in the future.
And our organization stands strongly with Steve on the issues of body camera. We worked together this legislative session on the same bill, trying to get it passed. It didn't, unfortunately, but I've worn a body camera for 2 years doing this job. I've seen the benefits that it brings. I use my own footage where I might make a mistake. Sorry, I just touched the mic. I use my own footage where I may have made a mistake to train other officers. Like, hey, here's something I didn't see right at that moment. Here's something that I would do better were I to do it again. But when we start talking about the legal responsibilities of officers, we have to use the language that's handed down to us from above, and that's the U.S. Supreme Court.
Do we have any idea what percentage of officers in Utah now are using them?
No, I think different departments are implementing them at different speeds based upon budget, based upon availability, and several departments are doing reviews as to what type of body camera they will use. I know that several large departments have started using them.
West Valley is completely equipped as of 2 weeks ago. Salt Lake City is high up there, and then other smaller agencies throughout the state have been there or are getting there.
Anecdotally, I assume that this changes the way an officer does his job when they're wearing a body camera.
No.
No.
Well, not just anecdotally, but I think that there was a study done in California about a police department that started using body cameras, and they noticed that citizen complaints went down. Now there's some disagreement as to why they went down. Maybe it's citizens knew that they couldn't complain anymore, but also another explanation is that in fact police officers knew that their actions were being recorded and knew that they had to be a little bit more careful.
Well, and I think when you dig into that study a little bit, you do see the way complaints roll in when somebody's there to complain, and that's their right, absolutely. If you believe you've been mistreated or there could have been a better way, or you just had some questions about why an officer did, I suggest you do go to that department and start talking to them. The doors of communication are usually going to be open, or should be open. But the vast majority of police misconduct claims, when confronted with video evidence, the officer is exonerated 100%. Yeah. My experience, I guess I should say, not just anecdotally but personally, has been that it didn't change the way I did the job. It changed the way people saw how I did my job. Now there was defense attorneys, prosecutors, judges, and juries, family members of the suspects that I encountered that now had documented evidence that, hey, this is really the way it went down.
Well, and it's interesting to note that, somebody like Ian who takes pride in his work, I think that most officers do, but there are certain officers, just like the rest of population or just like any other profession, there are some bad apples. And so those officers who maybe recognize that they're not following all the rules, they may decide to correct their action because they know somebody can review it.
I assume this is a two-way street as well for the suspects.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, and it's interesting because we are very supportive of using body cameras, and we're disappointed that it didn't pass in the legislature. But we recognize that most of the time, the body camera footage will give evidence against our clients. At the same time, we are so focused on this idea that innocent people should not be convicted and should have all the evidence available to them to present to a jury or a judge, that we think it's imperative that body cameras are used as much as possible to exonerate those people who are innocent.
The real question that comes down to, and this will be the dissenting opinion, is actually I'm not really in favor of technological solutions to the issue of police violence, police brutality, and these kind of things. Now, yes, there are a large majority of encounters that Ian has pointed out that resolve themselves peacefully, and nobody gets injured or murdered. The big thing to point out is still the fact that every 28 hours in America, a black person is killed. The profession itself existed since the times of the Fugitive Slave Act. So when you talk about the profession of policing as such, and you are faced with the consequences of somebody losing their life every 28 hours, and then the first thing that is brought up is always, well, did that person have a criminal history? Those are the side of issues that I'm interested in. I'm interested in why does America have more police shootings than every other industrialized country? Why do we have a larger prison population? Now, all of that doesn't necessarily get shifted down onto each individual officer to bear the brunt of this, but there are larger systemic issues we should talk about. And as police officers operate within those systems, You know, they have a role to play. Not to say that each one of them is a secret KKK member, unfortunately, or fortunately, actually, even. Sorry. Those persons were actually dismissed from police departments in Florida. And then you had the recent DOJ study in Ferguson where the entire department was investigated for racism, and you had sergeants, you had everybody sort of saying, well, I'm jumping off the ship now because it's sinking. So the real question is, yes, there's technology, it does a thing, but does it actually do the thing that we on the streets want it to do, we in the communities want it to do?
And I think it's interesting. I've seen this in other police critic organizations like Chris's. The reality of body cameras have not been good to the police critics, because basically every shooting that's come out that's been recorded locally has shown the officer doing the very best he or she could, doing the very best, acting in a lawful manner, is respectful leading up to the encounter as possible.
I disagree with that vehemently, actually. The Braun Cruz encounter with Dylan Taylor, literally he exited the vehicle with a gun in hand and said, get down on the ground, show me your hands, show me your hands.
Hold that thought. I'm going to go to a break and come back and talk about that in just a moment. This is Utah Matters. We're talking about lethal force by the police force. We'll be right back. Gentlemen, welcome back to Utah Matters. We have Ian Adams, who is the spokesman for the Fraternal Order of Police of Utah. By the way, we should mention that you are here speaking for that organization and not as a police officer. You are a police officer in a local department here, but you have to separate those roles.
This is my volunteer job, yeah.
Okay.
I do work for I volunteer with the Utah Fraternal Order of Police as their spokesperson. I am a local police officer.
Very good. Steve Burton is with the Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers in Utah.
That's right.
And Chris Manor is the director of Utah Against Police Brutality. I want to pick it up with another situation here. This is the Dylan Taylor circumstance. Chris, your organization is well focused into this. We want to look at the tape from the video from the body cam from the policeman in this situation. Why don't you set that up?
There was a 911 phone call of a suspicious person. The caller told the dispatcher that there was a weapon, a gun. The dispatcher tried to confirm where on the body of the suspect or which suspect had it. It turns out to be Dylan Taylor with his brother Jarrell, or his cousin, sorry, and then his brother as well. Anyways, they're outside of a 7-Eleven. They had just gone to the corner store to get snacks, food, beverage, whatever. And as they come out, they're confronted with police officers ordering them to get to the ground. Two of them go to the ground. Dylan Taylor begins to walk away. And as he's walking away, he has his hands down in his pants, and he begins to lift his shirt up to show the officer, like, I don't have anything. He gets about this high. And at this point, the officer proceeds to use lethal force and takes his life. The first thing uttered after the shots are fired, as the officer becomes a first responder to administer first aid or whatever, is, oh, whoa, buddy, where's the gun at? So the question, of course, was this a justified shooting? Legally, Sim Guild deemed it a justified shooting. According to the letter of the law, it's a justified shooting. But at the same time, we still have to question, why is Dylan Taylor dead now? Who's there to pick up the pieces? Where does the justice come in? And that's what the family members have been really concerned about, and also preventing future situations.
Okay, Ian, let's take this circumstance, not specifically if we don't want to do that, but a person who, that issue of, which is very common, a person who has their hands in their clothing or whatever, and may appear to have a gun but don't. How often is that circumstance confronted?
I don't know. What are you asking specifically?
Well,
there?
I guess for both of you.
Yeah.
It's a difficult circumstances because you don't know if he does or don't know if he doesn't.
Right.
What was the officer told going into the?
Here's a situation where the officer's told by, again, a member of the public, grows concerned and says there's 3 males, one of them has a gun at the 7-Eleven. Very common place to get robbed with a gun. In an officer's experience, in an officer's lifetime, I guarantee you he will see a 7-Eleven robbed with a gun several times. The officer shows up, 3 males matching that description at the walking out of the 7-Eleven. He confronts them as he should. 2 of them do the right thing, which is, if they weren't doing anything, so they say, they freeze, they go to the ground, they follow the officer's commands. Another starts to walk or run away, and then you know, I think it was characterized a little bit wrong. Watching the video, Dylan Taylor lifts his shirt as if he's, you know, clearing his waistband to grab a gun and says, "Nah, fool." Now, let's back up 24, 48 hours and look at Dylan Taylor's Facebook page. This is all in the investigation.
Well, the question is why do we have to investigate
because it gives
an
us,
individual's information at the time of the shooting is irrelevant because the officer
it's not irrelevant. It gives an insight into to that person's mindset, and that person's mindset, yeah, retroactively. It says that 24 hours earlier, he's saying, "I'm not going back to jail. I'd rather die. I'm not going back to jail. I know I got warrants. I'm not going back to jail. I'd rather die." Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that you have an officer with limited information, but potentially lethal information. You have an individual who's dedicated not to going back to jail, knows how to create that reaction in the officer, and I believe that's exactly what happened, and that's why the investigation cleared that officer. That officer did what he could with the information at the time. He reacted to the suspect's behavior.
Stephen, your view on this? What would you, again, the 1 minute after, what would you review with this officer and say, again, we're Monday morning quarterbacking, and that's a big wish. In all respects, but what would you say? How would you have diffused this situation?
Well, I mean, it's extremely tragic, and frankly, I don't think that either one of them had ill will, right? I mean, we don't know exactly why he was there, why he started walking away, and we don't believe that the officer went there in order to shoot someone. The thing that was disappointing to me, and I saw as tragic, was that the officer ordered him to show his hands or to lift his hands up. And it was almost as he was obeying that order of the officer that then the officer interpreted that as reaching for a gun or producing a weapon, and he shot him. So, you know, I don't think that the officer thought through that process, but it may have in fact been the order that the officer was giving that produced that person's actions and caused him to have to shoot him. And so, you know, again, we can look back at these incidents because there is a body camera and because people don't exactly remember the situation perfectly. Our memories are not perfect. But now we can look at it and say, the order maybe should have been slowly lift your hands out to the side or something different that wouldn't have produced that necessity or the necessity in the officer's mind to pull the trigger.
I want to show you something while we talk about this. Are you familiar with the situation in Mississippi and the screwdriver?
Yes, the mentally ill male comes to the door and then attempts to get the officer.
Okay, we're showing this to you now. This is a body cam camera, and the person on the doorstep, his mother or sister or whoever it was, called the police and said he's becoming violent. When they come, he's holding a screwdriver, and he makes a threat to the police, at which time they shoot him.
Well, it's not a verbal threat. He makes a physical threat. He starts coming towards the officers.
Correct.
Nearly immediately upon opening the door.
So my question is about the weapon or the perceived weapon that the person has.
Mm-hmm.
Are they all treated the same, whether he's got a gun or a screwdriver?
Well, no, those would be different and treated differently, but a screwdriver by itself, even if you recognize that it was a screwdriver in his hand, let's assume that's what the officers knew. It happened so fast. If you watch that video, who knows what the actual officers are actually perceiving? Are they perceiving it as a knife? Are they perceiving it as a screwdriver? Who knows? But even if they perceived it as a screwdriver can absolutely kill you. Absolutely kill you. And if somebody's advancing on you and is going to stick a screwdriver in you, that is a lethal threat.
Do you know policies in other departments around the country? Are they pretty much in line with each other on that particular matter?
Well, I don't know that any policy would address specifically whether this object's to be considered a lethal threat, right? Mm-hmm. It's a totality of the circumstances. But as far as I'm aware, you know, I don't think you're going to find too many officers or too many departments out of line with the Supreme Court cases we talked about earlier, Graham v. Connor, Graham v. Connor, Tennessee v. Garner, all those.
When we come back after this quick break, I want to talk about investigating these shootings and who does it and how they do it. When we come back on Utah Matters. We're talking about lethal force. We're going to talk about investigations and who looks over these particular incidents. What's the first stop in terms of an investigation? Who does that in most police departments?
Well, it has recently changed. Legislation passed this session which changes that procedure and makes a statewide procedure. Before this legislation was passed, there were different policies for each jurisdiction. Different departments did it differently. Typically, it was the county attorney over the jurisdiction in which the shooting happened that would do the criminal investigation, and then there was some sort of internal investigation. The Fraternal Order of the Police worked on legislation and passed legislation this session, which requires that the police chief and the county attorney or district attorney will work together to choose a separate agency to do that investigation. And so it's more uniform now, but I don't know if that has been used because the legislation is either awaiting the governor's signature or was just barely passed.
Yeah, I think we're waiting on the time a little bit there. But it's important to recognize this is a bill that our organization found important because we wanted to give more clarity to the public. There is a great deal of concern around these issues. I said before, it's an extraordinary event when an officer takes a life. It deserves extraordinary scrutiny. Most of the best practices adopted within that bill were already in play in the major metropolitan counties in this state. However, to provide a framework for every agency statewide, we felt was a good goal, and we accomplished that goal.
I want to address the issue of race in this. The incidents going on throughout the country and the jabber throughout the country, the wall-to-wall coverage in the country is really focused on race out of Ferguson. And I don't want to go through those incidents. President Obama got into the middle of this, Eric Holder got into the middle of this, and is your view that that was helpful in the situations that are going on here? No.
A.G. Holder's injection into this incident caused it to spin out of control. In my opinion, and the organization of the Fraternal Order of Police's opinion, he made it about race when it wasn't about race. So, and frankly, the DOJ's own investigation of Officer Wilson completely vindicated his report and completely showed the whole the whole debate around hands up, don't shoot was a lie. It was fabricated. It was complete fabrication. Unfortunately, the city of Ferguson is paying the price of that fabrication.
Officer Adams, or Ian Adams, in this role, what feeling do you get from fellow officers, from other people other officers you've dealt with? How are they feeling about how they're viewed on the street since all of this has come down, especially the stuff outside of the state?
Utah officers were extraordinarily lucky to live in a supportive state, quite honestly. I mean, even during the height of tensions nationwide, people were still trying to buy me lunch and dinner at work. People were still saying thank you. I think officers in general we're starting to see the pendulum swing back a little bit, especially with the beginning of this year, so many clearly justified police shootings. I think the public began to step away from communist organizations like Utah Against Police Brutality and back towards the police departments that serve them every day.
Steve, any thoughts on that? What are you hearing?
I mean, as a criminal defense lawyer, we know that officers, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that they profile certain types of people. Oftentimes that's based upon facts that they observe or behaviors that they are doing. And as a defense attorney, I want to preserve the rights of all people who are accused of a crime or who find themselves interacting with law enforcement. And so I think that it's important that we do implement this third witness, this independent witness of body cameras, to be able to see exactly what goes on so we can really start to look at these issues and see these interactions, and us as a people, we can determine if the power that we've given to law enforcement is being used in the way we want it to be used, or if we need to put additional checks and balances on there and train the officers to act in a different way. I think that in large part, officers are doing a great job, and most officers are very honest. But if we're able to look back at these situations and monitor the situation more closely, we can pick out those bad apples or the officers who do have malintent or are not following the rules.
Exiting, last thought, what would you do?
Well, the tone on the streets, I would just say, and you may want to add communist and police critic to my description of my name, is that every time a person is killed, that's a family that's impacted, that's a community that's impacted, and those people will continue to mobilize, and they'll become continually disaffected with the excuses that police officers come up with the justifications that are come up with the state level, and so more and more people become disaffected and disillusioned with the so-called democracy that we live in, which has the police officers, getting away every single time without facing even so much as a jury trial.
Rasmussen poll just out this week says 63% say media coverage is making it more dangerous for police officers to do their job. This quote, Americans are solidly convinced that their local police are their protectors and give them high marks for the job that they do. 56% of voters now think the Justice Department is more concerned with politics than with making sure justice is done. And they relate this to Ferguson.
It's both a happy and a sad commentary there. Again, most people are happy with the local policing that's given to them. Most police officers are happy to be providing that service and get up day and night, 24/7, 365, to stand watch in our communities.
Ian Adams, Fraternal Order of Police in Utah, Stephen Burton with the Criminal Defense Lawyers Association, and Chris Manor with Utah Against Brutality, Police Brutality, I should say. Thank you so much for being with us in this discussion. We hope all goes well for all of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us on Utah Matters. We will see you next week.